A smirk, a showdown, and a turning point in the courtroom. That sounds like something I'd expect from a first-year law student. With those cutting words, Judge William Alsup dismissed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's legal argument. The remark drew a sharp intake of breath from the packed federal courtroom. It wasn't just the bluntness that stunned the audience. It was the fact that a federal judge had openly ridiculed a sitting congresswoman, a black woman, and a former public defender. For a moment, the only sound in the ornate Washington, D.C. courthouse was the scratching of reporters' pens. Then came the smirk. Alsup leaned back in his chair, the faint smile on his face, signaling what many had long suspected. He believed he was untouchable, insulated by decades of authority on the bench. But what followed next transformed the hearing into a clash that could redefine how Americans view judicial power. The setting, a case that could reshape voting rights. This wasn't just another hearing. The stakes were enormous. At issue was whether newly imposed voting restrictions in several states would survive or be struck down. Civil rights groups had described it as the most consequential voting rights case in a generation. If the restrictions held, millions, particularly voters in communities of color, could face new barriers at the ballot box ahead of the next election. The courtroom was filled to capacity that morning. With its vaulted ceilings and dark wood walls, the space radiated gravitas. Reporters filled every bench, cameras waited outside, and whispers carried through the room. Everyone knew this ruling could shift the balance of American democracy. The judge, a long career and a controversial shift. Justice William Alsup was no stranger to the spotlight. Appointed by President Bill Clinton in 1999, the now 78-year-old had presided over headline-grabbing cases involving tech giants like Google and Uber, as well as constitutional battles that shaped national policy. Known for his sharp intellect and even sharper tongue, Alsup had earned the nickname the Smirking Judge, a reference to the half-smile he often flashed when dismissing arguments he found weak. But in recent years, legal observers noted a change. Once regarded as a balanced jurist, Alsup's rulings had begun tilting noticeably rightward, especially on cases involving civil rights. Progressive lawyers, particularly women of color, often found themselves cut off mid-argument, while their male counterparts were allowed far more leeway. Critics warned that his growing impatience risked undermining the appearance of judicial neutrality. The challenger, Jasmine Crockett, the giant slayer. Facing him that day was someone who had never been afraid of a fight. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th District, was still new to Capitol Hill at age 42. But long before her election, she had built a formidable reputation in Texas courtrooms as a civil rights attorney and public defender. Colleagues called her the Giant Slayer after she won case after case against powerful opponents. With more than 100 trials behind her, Crockett was anything but inexperienced. As a member of both the House Judiciary Committee and the Congressional Black Caucus, she had a direct stake in the outcome of this case. That morning, she wasn't in court to observe. She was there to speak, granted time to present her perspective through an amicus brief. Her goal was clear: to challenge restrictions she believed would silence millions of American voters. The tension builds. The clash between Crockett and Alsup was not born that morning. Just a day earlier, in preliminary arguments, the judge had repeatedly interrupted female attorneys, while giving male lawyers wide latitude. Observers whispered about bias, about the shifting tone of a man who once balanced both sides, but now seemed impatient with voices pushing for change. So, when Crockett gripped her legal pad and fixed her gaze squarely on the veteran judge, the room felt electric. This wasn't just a legal debate. It was a test of willpower, a battle between old authority and new defiance, a moment that could resonate far beyond the four walls of the courtroom. The clash intensifies. When Jasmine Crockett's legal team presented statistics on voter disenfranchisement, Judge William Alsup barely concealed his disdain. He rolled his eyes, muttered about typical exaggeration, and refused to hide his skepticism. Reporters in the front row caught every expression, every word. Rumours swirled that Alsup had confided to colleagues he didn't see why a freshman congresswoman deserved a place at his bench at all. It was only under pressure from higher courts that he reluctantly granted Crockett the right to speak. So, when she stepped to the podium that morning, the entire room felt the weight of the moment. Alsup didn't even look up from his papers, his dismissal obvious. When he finally raised his gaze, his trademark smirk returned, an expression that had cowed countless attorneys. But this time, he was facing someone different. A different kind of advocate. Jasmine Crockett had spent years battling hostile judges and entrenched racism in Texas courtrooms. Now, as both a congresswoman and a seasoned civil rights lawyer, she carried not only her legal expertise, but the voices of her constituents. She was not there as a politician seeking headlines. She was there as an attorney defending the rights of voters who risked losing their access to the ballot box. Your Honour, she began firmly, before I address the legal merits, I want to respond to your characterization of our arguments yesterday. The smirk widened. Alsup leaned forward. Congresswoman, this is my courtroom. I've been interpreting constitutional law since before you passed the bar. If you have real arguments, get to them, without the lecture. The air grew heavy with silence. The battle lines were drawn. Constitution versus authority. With all due respect, Your Honour, Crockett replied, her voice rising with conviction. I passed the bar after studying the same constitution you did. That document doesn't change based on how many decades one has interpreted it. The courtroom stirred. For a brief moment, the smirk faltered, but Alsup quickly snapped back. Congresswoman, in this courtroom, I am the final authority on constitutional interpretation. Your political position grants you no special expertise. Crockett's eyes flashed, but she remained composed. I'm not speaking here as a politician. I'm speaking as an attorney representing the very voters who stand to be disenfranchised if these restrictions survive. Alsup tapped his gavel lightly. The impact of these measures is exactly what this court must decide. Your assumption of disenfranchisement presupposes the conclusion. Evidence on the record. Crockett calmly opened her folder. Then let's examine the evidence, Your Honour. May I present the statistical analysis that was interrupted yesterday? You may proceed, Alsup replied with a dismissive wave. Though I'll note for the record, statistics can be twisted to prove almost anything. Gasps and murmurs rippled among the civil rights attorneys present. Still, Crockett pressed on. She laid out carefully gathered data showing how the new restrictions disproportionately hurt minority communities, rural voters, and the elderly. Alsup's interruptions came quickly and sharply. These numbers ignore alternative voting methods, he interjected. Actually, Your Honour, Crockett countered smoothly, if you'll turn to page 17 of our brief, you'll see a complete analysis of all affected methods. Alsup frowned, flipping through the documents with irritation. He had not expected such a precise rebuttal. His next challenge came quickly. And what about the state's interest in preventing fraud? Crockett, unfazed, was ready. Evidence that cut through the noise. Let's turn to Exhibit C, Your Honour. With a steady hand, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett revealed a chart that left little room for debate. Over 2 decades, across millions of ballots, there had been fewer than 30 proven cases of voter fraud. These isolated incidents, she explained, cannot justify sweeping laws that threaten to block hundreds of thousands of lawful voters from the polls. Judge William Alsup shifted uncomfortably, his authority challenged in real time. Fraud prevention is the state's responsibility, he shot back. Lawmakers have an obligation to act before problems spiral out of control. That obligation must be weighed alongside the right to vote. Crockett seized the moment. And the judiciary, she replied, has an obligation to examine whether those laws trample the Constitution. Deference to legislatures cannot replace scrutiny when fundamental rights are at stake. A constitutional duel. The judge's tone turned sharp. Congresswoman, I am well acquainted with judicial review. I've practiced it longer than you've been in this profession. Crockett leaned in. Then you'll recall the Supreme Court's ruling in Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections, which held that wealth, or the ability to pay fees, has no place in determining who gets to vote. That case was about poll taxes, Alsup countered. These statutes involve verification measures. Verification that forces citizens to purchase documents or travel long distances, creating financial barriers no different in effect from poll taxes, she shot back. The mechanism may have changed. The burden remains the same. The reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a high-stakes debate over the very role of courts in protecting democracy. The bias question frustrated, Alsup tried to undercut her. Congresswoman Crockett, stirring rhetoric may impress the press gallery, but this court deals in law, not in feelings about voting rights. The words landed poorly. Many in the audience stiffened, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. Crockett paused, then delivered a line that cracked the room open. Isn't it curious, she said, her voice steady, that when men argue passionately about the Second Amendment or corporate political speech, their work is labelled intellectual, but when a black woman argues passionately about voting rights, the cornerstone of democracy, it's dismissed as emotion. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Alsup's smirk was gone, replaced with a hard stare. I caution you, Congresswoman, be careful not to accuse this court of bias. I'm not accusing, she replied evenly. I'm pointing to a consistent pattern that cannot be ignored in a case about equal access to the ballot. Using his own words. Then, with calculated precision, Crockett introduced a transcript. This is from the Shelby County decision, Your Honor. At the time, you wrote, "Times have changed, and extraordinary protections may no longer be needed. Yet the data presented today shows suppression tactics haven't vanished. They've simply evolved." Flustered, Alsup snapped, "You are twisting my words." "Then, clarify them," Crockett challenged, "because for millions of voters, it looks like the judiciary is stepping back at the very moment new barriers are rising." A rare retreat. The silence was heavy. Then, with a sharp rap of his gavel, Judge Alsup announced a recess. Without meeting anyone's eyes, he left for his chambers. The gallery broke into a low roar. Lawyers exchanged glances of disbelief. For years, Judge Alsup had been considered immovable, his authority unquestioned. Now, for the first time, it appeared someone had forced him to retreat. Journalists raced to file their stories. They knew what had just happened would dominate headlines nationwide. A courtroom. Reset Jasmine Crockett stayed at the podium during the recess, flipping through her notes with calm precision. Members of her legal team quietly congratulated her for standing firm, but she only gave a small shake of the head. This battle wasn't finished. When Judge William Alsup re-entered the chamber 15 minutes later, he looked different. The smugness was gone. In its place was a rigid, steely expression. He had returned ready to reassert control. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice cutting across the silence. "Before the break, you levelled some strong accusations of judicial bias. Let me remind you, respect for this court is not optional." Crockett inclined her head. I assure you, Your Honour, my respect for this institution is absolute. That is precisely why I believe these concerns must be confronted openly. Then, let's return to the law, Alsup pressed, not impressions of attitude. Legal, precedent, on trial. Very well, Crockett replied, calmly turning to another section of her binder. Let's look at Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, the Supreme Court case upholding Indiana's voter ID law. Allup's brow eased slightly. At last, precedent. As Your Honour knows, Crockett continued, the court upheld the law because the state established a legitimate interest and showed the burden on voters was minimal. She paused, locking eyes with him. But the decision also emphasised that its reasoning was tied to the specific factual record in that case. And our record here is very different. What followed was a surgical dismantling of the state's position. Crockett outlined how the restrictions under review imposed far heavier burdens, targeting certain groups, minorities, rural voters, the elderly, with remarkable precision. Each time Alsup interrupted, she had an answer. That's speculation, he snapped. Respectfully, Your Honour, it's statistical evidence based on methodologies your own court has previously accepted. The state has provided contrary analysis, he pushed back, which, Your Honour, has already been discredited by 3 independent experts. Observers could sense the shift. The judge who usually commanded every inch of his courtroom was being met, point for point, by Crockett's preparation. A critical misstep. Then frustration slipped into error. Congresswoman, Alsup said, his tone sharpened, in politics, dramatic speeches about voter suppression may earn applause, but this is not a campaign rally. This is a court of law. Stick to the legal standards, not convenient stories about disenfranchisement. The words landed like a thunderclap. Civil rights attorneys winced. Reporters' pens froze mid-sentence. Even Crockett herself seemed momentarily stunned. She drew a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and spoke with a voice softer than before, yet more commanding for it. Your Honour, did you just describe the systematic denial of Americans' constitutional right to vote as a convenient narrative? The question hung in the still air, unanswerable yet impossible to ignore. Alsup, realising the gravity of his slip, tried to retreat. My reference was to whether these verification measures can legally be considered suppression, a matter this court has not yet decided. But Crockett did not release her grip. With respect, Your Honour, your words went further. You dismissed voter disenfranchisement itself as little more than emotional appeals and convenient narratives. That cannot stand unchallenged. The chamber was silent except for the scratching of pens. It was clear. The judge's authority was no longer unquestioned. The very act of dismissing our arguments reveals you've already formed an opinion about the merits, Your Honour. Crockett's voice was steady, deliberate. And that raises a serious question, whether those who fight for voting rights can expect impartial treatment in this courtroom. A ripple of shock swept through the gallery. Federal judges were rarely challenged so openly, and never in their own domain. Judge William Alsup's face turned crimson. Congresswoman Crockett, he warned sharply, you are walking dangerously close to contempt. The tension spiked. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Attorneys exchanged wary glances. Everyone waited to see if she would retreat. Instead, she reached calmly into her briefcase and pulled out a small, well-worn book. Your Honour, I carry this pocket constitution with me every day. She raised it high enough for the audience to see. The 15th Amendment states clearly, the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, colour, or previous condition of servitude. That protection is not a narrative. It is the law of this nation. She placed the book gently on the podium. If defending that text places me in contempt, then I will accept those consequences. The chamber went still. Legal analysts later said it was one of the most extraordinary moments ever witnessed in federal court. Alsup, realizing his threat had cornered him instead, hesitated. To punish her now would only confirm the very bias she had exposed. After an awkward pause, he leaned back and said, his voice subdued, "Proceed with your legal arguments, Congresswoman." It was clear to everyone. The first round had gone to Crockett, but the fight was far from finished. Raising the stakes. As the hearing resumed, Alsup tried to regain the upper hand. "Congresswoman," he said curtly, "you've made bold claims about the purpose of these laws. But as you well know, intent must be proven, not assumed." Crockett gave a small nod, as if she had been waiting for this exact challenge. "I'm glad you raised that, Your Honor," she replied. She gestured to her assistant, who stepped forward carrying a sealed folder. "These materials were obtained through discovery in a related state case," Crockett explained. "Until this morning, they were confidential. At 9:15 a.m., the state court lifted that order. We now have permission to present them." Alsup's eyes narrowed. "This court has not reviewed these documents." "That's correct, Your Honor, which is why we've prepared copies for the bench and for opposing counsel." Her team began handing out folders. Across the aisle, the state's lawyers flipped frantically through the pages, whispering to one another in alarm. "Objection!" the lead attorney shouted, springing to his feet. "These documents were not included in the Congresswoman's original brief." "They couldn't have been," Crockett replied evenly. "They weren't available at the time, but they are directly relevant to the issue of intent, an issue Your Honor just raised." Alsup scanned the first few pages, his stern expression faltering. He looked up. "And what exactly do you claim these papers demonstrate, Congresswoman?" Crockett stood tall. "This," she said, her tone deliberate, "is evidence of what the legislators who wrote these restrictions intended all along." The room fell silent. Every eye was on the podium. For the first time that day, the judge wasn't dictating the pace. Crockett was. The smoking gun. The documents spoke for themselves. They revealed that lawmakers behind the voting restrictions hadn't simply been drafting neutral election security policies. They had been openly strategizing about how to weaken the political influence of specific groups. One email described certain populations as demographic challenges to their party's hold on power. Another contained a spreadsheet charting turnout rates by race, age, and income, followed by proposals to target the voting methods most heavily used by minority communities. Then came the most chilling line of all. "If turnout in these 5 urban districts drops by just 3%, we lock in control indefinitely." The courtroom collectively shifted. Reporters scribbled in a frenzy. Civil rights lawyers exchanged knowing looks. They had long suspected this intent, but now it was in black and white. Across the aisle, the state's attorneys huddled together, their faces tight with alarm. Exposing the strategy, Crockett continued her careful presentation. Another message singled out historically black colleges and universities, describing them as opposition voter factories. The proposed solution: invalidate student IDs as proof of identity while leaving gun permits untouched. The effect was devastating. The smirk Judge Alsup had worn earlier in the day was gone. In its place was an expression of sober unease. For the first time, he seemed to recognize that what lay before him could not be waved aside. "These records have been verified," Crockett explained. "The state court ruled on their authenticity this morning. Metadata and digital signatures confirm they originated from official legislative accounts. She let the weight of that sink in before delivering her sharpest blow. The greatest danger isn't only that these lawmakers deliberately targeted minority voters, it's that they knew such tactics could not survive honest judicial review. So they hid their motives behind a facade of neutral language. Holding up one final email, she read aloud, "Always frame everything around election security. Do not mention demographic impacts in writing. We need neutral justifications for the courts." The silence was deafening. This was no longer just a policy debate. It was evidence of a deliberate scheme to mislead the judiciary itself. Turning the judge's words back, Judge Alsup sat motionless for several beats before speaking in a softer tone than before. "Congresswoman Crockett, this material raises serious issues. The court will need time to examine it carefully." But Crockett wasn't finished. She drew the connection back to where the clash had begun. "Your Honor, earlier today, you dismissed concerns about disenfranchisement as little more than convenient narratives. These emails show why that skepticism is so dangerous. The legislators who wrote these laws counted on courts to look no further than their pretexts. They relied on judicial reluctance to probe deeper into discrimination." She gestured toward the pile of documents spread before the bench. "They were banking on exactly the kind of disbelief you expressed this morning." The words hung in the air like a verdict of their own. The judge, who had started the day dismissive and smirking, now found himself implicated in the very dynamic that enabled suppression to flourish. A weak defense. The state's attorneys scrambled to recover. They argued that the messages were cherry-picked, that they represented only a handful of lawmakers, not the whole legislature. But every claim faltered when Crockett pointed to yet another damning passage. When they insisted that demographic challenges could simply mean partisan opponents in general, she read aloud a line from a different message. "AA turnout, African American turnout, is the problem area we must address." No one in the chamber missed the clarity of that statement. The defense was unraveling before their eyes. A judge's rare admission. By late afternoon, the case had shifted beyond recognition. What started as a legal battle over voting restrictions had turned into something larger, an exposure of discriminatory intent and the judiciary's role in overlooking it. Then came the moment no one in the courtroom would forget. Judge William Alsup, who had been studying the pile of documents while lawyers exchanged arguments, suddenly raised his hand. The chatter stopped instantly. His voice, when he spoke, sounded nothing like the sharp, dismissive tone from earlier. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began slowly, "when you opened your presentation this morning, I doubted you. I believed you were bringing politics into this chamber, exaggerating concerns about suppression." He paused, searching for words. "But these documents suggest I was wrong." The gallery gasped. Federal judges almost never admitted fault in public. Yet here he was, acknowledging the evidence had not only revealed discriminatory intent, but also shown a calculated effort to disguise that intent with neutral language to mislead the courts. Removing his glasses, Alsup rubbed his forehead. His next words carried a weight everyone in the room felt. "This court has a constitutional responsibility to safeguard the right to vote, especially when confronted with deliberate attempts to undermine it. I will review these materials carefully and reconsider my earlier position." Then he looked directly at Crockett. The smirk that had defined his demeanor for years was gone. "Congresswoman, I owe you an apology. Your arguments were not emotional grandstanding. They were principled advocacy for constitutional rights, and that is exactly what our system depends on." The room erupted in murmurs. Crockett, composed as ever, simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. The right to vote is the foundation of our democracy. Defending it is defending the Constitution itself." a historic turning point. Legal analysts in the chamber whispered to one another. They had just witnessed history. A federal judge publicly reversing course, and a congresswoman, armed with preparation, courage, and evidence, forcing that shift in real time. What Crockett accomplished that day was more than a courtroom win. She had exposed not only the legislators' discriminatory intent, but also the judicial skepticism that allowed such tactics to flourish. Within hours, news outlets seized on the story. Hashtags like Bolshevik Crockett Blow trended across social media. Blogs covering constitutional law described it as a watershed moment in voting rights litigation. On television, CNN's legal analyst called it the most significant courtroom clash on voting rights since challenges to the Voting Rights Act. MSNBC aired a special segment titled, "How Congresswoman Crockett Changed the Game." Even Fox News covered the exchange, though their framing cast it as judicial independence being tested by congressional overreach. The aftermath. By evening, the emails Crockett had unveiled were being published, carefully redacted by major outlets. The blunt language stunned many Americans, who had assumed such overt targeting of minority voters was relic of the past. One particularly shocking message from a state legislator read, "These communities only started voting in the last few decades. If turnout is lowered, we secure control for good." The word spread like wildfire, igniting debates not just in legal circles, but across kitchen tables and newsrooms nationwide. What had begun as one congresswoman facing down a smirking judge had grown into a national reckoning over race, power, and democracy itself. The shockwave. Among the leaked emails was one line that cut especially deep. If voters can't handle extra paperwork, maybe they're not committed enough to deserve a ballot. The bluntness stunned the nation. The public reaction was immediate. Civil rights groups mobilized, filing fresh lawsuits against similar restrictions in other states. Law schools announced they would study the hearing transcript as a case study in modern constitutional advocacy. Legal scholars quickly circulated articles noting that Crockett's strategy, combining sharp legal precedent with documentary proof of discriminatory intent, might provide a new roadmap for the courts. Even the White House took notice. According to the Washington Post, senior advisors gathered to discuss the fallout. "This changes our entire voting rights strategy," one official said. "Crockett showed us how to pull back the curtain on what these laws are really about." Consequences for the judge. For Judge William Alsup, the episode was nothing short of seismic. Few federal judges of his stature had ever admitted error in public, and the admission reverberated across the legal community. Critics on the right accused him of surrendering to political pressure. Others, however, praised his candour, calling it a rare act of judicial humility. 3 days later, Alsup issued a preliminary injunction, halting the voting restrictions until a full trial could take place. His 87-page opinion leaned heavily on the emails Congresswoman Crockett had presented. He concluded that the evidence demonstrated a clear pattern of intentional discrimination disguised as election security. Most strikingly, Alsup acknowledged his own blind spots in writing. This court recognizes that skepticism toward claims of discrimination can itself become a barrier to justice. By beginning from doubt rather than inquiry, judges risk enabling the very deception presented in this case. For many legal scholars, this was as groundbreaking as the injunction itself. Harvard professor Lawrence Tribe wrote on X, formerly Twitter, "Alsup's admission may prove as important as his ruling. It signals a shift in how judges must confront their own assumptions about discrimination." Crockett's rising profile. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing transformed her almost overnight into a national figure. Voting rights advocates lauded her as a hero. Universities invited her to deliver guest lectures. Civil rights organizations sought her involvement in upcoming lawsuits across the country. In an interview on CNN a week later, Crockett downplayed the personal spotlight. "What happened in that courtroom wasn't about me or Judge Alsup," she said. "It was about whether courts are willing to see what's happening to voting rights in this country. For too long, restrictions that target minority voters have been given the benefit of the doubt. That day, we stripped away the disguise." When asked if she had felt intimidated by Alsup's early dismissiveness, she smiled. "I've faced skeptical judges my whole career. As a black woman lawyer in Texas, I knew I'd always have to be twice as prepared, twice as persuasive. But I also knew that the facts and the Constitution are powerful weapons when you use them well." Political fallout. The political consequences were swift. Legislators directly implicated in the emails came under heavy fire. Within weeks, 2 resigned. Others faced serious primary challenges from within their own party. The governor, seeking to distance himself, announced a sweeping review of the state's election procedures. Meanwhile, lawmakers in 3 other states quietly shelved similar bills. "Nobody wants to be caught in the next email scandal," one legislator admitted to the New York Times. Most importantly, Crockett's confrontation with Alsup had sparked a broader national conversation, not only about voting rights, but about the judicial mindset toward discrimination itself. For many, the case marked the beginning of a shift, a recognition that courts too must guard against the temptation to dismiss claims of injustice before the evidence is heard. The Crockett effect. In the months that followed, the legal world could not stop talking about the confrontation. Major law reviews released special editions analyzing how judicial skepticism, rooted in decisions like Shelby County versus Holder, had shaped the decline of voting rights protections. Bar associations organized workshops on implicit bias in the courtroom. 6 months later, researchers surveyed federal rulings on election law. The findings were striking. Voting rights claims were succeeding at a higher rate than before. Analysts credited part of this shift to what they began calling the Crockett effect, a new attentiveness among judges to look beyond surface-level justifications for restrictive laws. In law schools, Crockett's hearing became a standard case study. Professors highlighted how her mix of painstaking preparation, strategic framing, and moral conviction had changed the course of litigation. As Yale professor Stephen put it, she didn't just win a case. She forced judges to confront the distance between neutral pretexts and discriminatory realities. The personal impact. For ordinary citizens, the outcome was more than theory. Community leaders in affected districts organized rallies of gratitude. Elderly voters wrote letters saying the blocked restrictions would have kept them from the polls. To them, Crockett's persistence was not abstract advocacy. It was the difference between having a voice and being silenced. A year later, the final ruling. 12 months after the showdown, Crockett returned to Alsup's courtroom for the final ruling. The atmosphere was unrecognizable from their first encounter. Gone was the smirk, replaced by a judge who treated her with open respect. His opinion permanently struck down the challenged laws and went further. He ordered the state to submit any future voting changes to federal pre-clearance, effectively restoring a safeguard the Supreme Court had weakened in Shelby County. Legal experts immediately labeled it groundbreaking and predicted an appeal that could eventually land at the nation's highest court. One constitutional scholar remarked, "This may be the case that reshapes voting rights law for an entire generation." Words for the textbooks. In closing, Judge Alsup penned lines destined for legal history. "The right to vote is preservative of all other rights. When that right is deliberately burdened, courts must not stand aside. We are not politicians, but guardians of constitutional principles. This court began with unwarranted skepticism. It ends with renewed vigilance, thanks to evidence and advocacy of the highest caliber." Crockett's final word. As Crockett left the courthouse, a reporter asked whether she felt vindicated by Allup's reversal. She shook her head. "This was never about me," she replied. "It was about vindicating the Constitution and protecting millions of Americans' right to vote. Judge Alsup showed courage by admitting his mistake and following the evidence. That's how our system should work." Pressed further, how did it feel to silence the smirk that had once dismissed her? Crockett smiled. "I didn't silence him. The facts did. The emails did. The Constitution did. I was simply the voice that carried them into the record." Observers later noted that her response captured the essence of her strategy. She never made the clash personal. She kept the focus on principle, evidence, and the voters whose rights were at stake. A lasting legacy. The confrontation would be remembered not just for its drama, but for the transformation it triggered in how courts, lawyers, and lawmakers approached voting rights. It proved that, with preparation, courage, and clarity, even the most skeptical judge could be persuaded to see the truth. A struggle without end. The confrontation in Allup's courtroom served as a stark reminder. The right to vote, the cornerstone of every other freedom, cannot be taken for granted. It requires vigilance, persistence, and a willingness to confront those who would weaken it. In a speech to the Congressional Black Caucus, months later, Jasmine Crockett drove that message home. The fight for voting rights did not end with the 15th Amendment, nor with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It continues every single day, in legislatures, in courtrooms, in every community where people's voices risk being silenced, and as long as voter suppression exists, there must be those prepared to resist it. Her words underscored the central question now facing the nation. Would other judges, when confronted with evidence of discrimination, follow Allup's example and confront uncomfortable truths? Or would they retreat to skepticism and deference, giving cover to lawmakers intent on restricting the vote? The answer, many agreed, would shape American democracy for decades to come. A new standard one thing was undeniable. The era of dismissing voting rights claims with a smirk had ended. Crockett had made sure of that. Across the country, similar cases were already winding through the courts. Legal analysts debated whether Allup's reversal marked the beginning of a broader judicial shift, or merely a rare exception. Either way, the Crockett effect had changed the terms of debate. Judges, legislators, and the public alike had been put on notice that voting rights litigation was not a relic of the past. It was the front line of democracy itself. The unfinished battle. The story is far from over. New challenges continue to test the limits of access to the ballot. Advocates remain locked in courtrooms, arguing over the very definition of equal participation in a republic. The open question remains: will more judges summon the courage to scrutinize restrictive laws with the rigor Alsup ultimately displayed, or will entrenched habits of disbelief return? What is clear is that the fight for the ballot box remains one of America's most urgent and enduring struggles,